So, just first things first, where are you in your Caribbean Studies syllabus? Is there anything that you need specific help with? Anything you want clarification on? Anything that you did in school and don't understand? Anything of that sort?
Could you give me like 2 minutes to grab my book,
No problem.
my text, and everything?
Hi, Shanice. Welcome. I guess I'll ask you the same question I just asked. How far have you gotten in your Caribbean Studies syllabus? Is there anything that you don't understand and you would like me to go over or explain? Anything that you need specific help with?
Good afternoon. My class just reached historical processes. We haven't reached far, so
Okay. So I guess I'll just recap from the beginning of the syllabus because all the parts before historical processes are basically just simple geography. We'll get that out of the way and then we'll get on to historical processes. But you don't have any problems with anything that you're not understanding.
not so far, sir.
Okay, so I have my book, and we got to the um, culture and society.
Culture and society. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've started on historical processes then? Or you finished it basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, if there's nothing that you're having particular problems with or you want me to explain anything, then we'll just go through the syllabus.
Okay. Okay. So I had a question for my teacher actually, but I'll ask you. So when we were talking about like slavery and stuff like that, she said that you could use the Bible to justify it. And why is that?
That's an interesting question and an interesting way of framing it. So when she says use the Bible, what she really means is there's what they call the slave Bible. I don't know if I'd be able to find any reference to actually show you it, but it is what they did is they went through the Bible, the King James version, and they did a lot of editing and a lot of um, editorializing, basically, and they took enough of it out of context so that the what was being said was twisted and in some cases completely reversed. And so when they say use the Bible to justify slavery, there's two meanings to that. The first is this slave Bible, that is the one that they actually allowed the slaves access to for the limited way that they were allowed to access any literature or even allowed to learn to read English. Um, it it isn't really the Bible, not the way that we know it today, and not the way that it has been traditionally. Um, it's it's just using air quotes the Bible, but because they were talking to West African people who, and this was at the point that they had introduced trying to use the Bible to suppress them, they would have been the domestic slave market and slave economy here in the Caribbean would have been very strong and very prominent by that time. And so it's not like you had just taken these people straight out of West Africa, all these. So in West Africa, where they came from, for example, in the kingdom of Mali, is a very common one that is mentioned, but there's also quite a few others. The Songhai, a lot of those West African kingdoms where the people would have come from and along the west coast were part of, not necessarily part of the Islamic Empire. In a way they were, but the way that Islam was practiced in a lot of these North and West African kingdoms was kind of a syncretism, a different um, way of practicing it, which is not strictly, halal necessarily, but it was the dominant cultural influence in these kingdoms. And so the first sets of people that they would have taken when they were originally starting the slave trade, and the majority of slaves in the Caribbean would have been, taken from Africa and brought here. They would have already had at least some religious background, whether it was in um, the other African religions that they had at the time, or whether it was with Islam, or both. But as they started, the way that slavery was done, it was done in a way to systematically and psychologically separate the people from their sense of humanity, so that it was easier to oppress them under a system that was explicitly designed around them not being treated as human beings. And so things like their language, for example, a lot of them, they just lost their language. They kept some traces of it in the way that they learned to speak English. Like a lot of our modern Caribbean dialects of English, or our English Creoles, our various different ways of speaking, are mostly English and some features of some of the other languages, whether it's West African languages or maybe even other European languages. There's a really interesting example in Trinidad of that, um, that I guess I would cover in communication studies. But so their language, their family structure, their culture, their music, their rituals, and of course any religious connection they had, or any spirituality that they had, the Europeans did their absolute best to suppress it and kind of beat it out of them, sometimes literally and sometimes psychologically. And so when they presented them with this um, biblical way of justifying slavery, it was easy enough for them to get these slaves to believe that this is actually what Christianity is about, or this is actually what the Bible is about. But again, it wasn't really the Bible as we know it today, and it was not the Bible as it was known traditionally. Um, that's a good question. Interesting. It's an interesting way of framing it, that they used the Bible to justify slavery, because they did in two ways. So the Age of Exploration, which starts in 1492 with Columbus and the other conquistadors, and started largely with the Spanish and also a little bit the Portuguese, but that's more in South America. And then that kind of evolved into the age of colonialism and imperialism, and the British sort of took over from that. A lot of the time, religion was used to justify it. With the Spanish, it was Roman Catholicism, and with the English, of course, it was the Church of England, or Anglicanism. And in both of those cases, they they came up with a lot of justifications for what they were doing. So, for example, the Spanish had this system of encomienda, where um, they were their aim was to, or their stated aim was to Christianize the indigenous peoples that they were forcing to work in the conditions that they were forced to work under. And that was just one example of religion being used as a tool for um, imperialism, colonialism, slavery. God, gold, and glory is the phrase that you hear when you talk about the conquistadors. God, gold, and glory. They did it for um, reasons of religious perpetuation, reasons of financial wealth, and for the glory of themselves, because a lot of them were soldiers who, once the war that they were fighting ended, didn't really have anything to do, and also for the glory of the empire that sent them. So I suppose you could say that they used the Bible to justify slavery, but it's important to keep in context that when you think of the Bible back then, and when you think of what the Church of England or even the Roman Catholic Church were doing at that time, it was very different from what the Bible or Christianity looked like nowadays, because of course it was used to enforce a system of dehumanization and genocide. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks for that.
No problem. Okay, so I guess we'll just go through historical perspectives. I'll just read through all the notes that I have here. If anybody has any questions or anything that they need explained, you can point it out. But since I think this should be all clear, this is really just to catch everybody up and get everyone on the same page. So historical processes, you start with migratory patterns. Migration being a common feature of Caribbean society, it's important to have a working understanding of the push and pull factors that led to the various different kinds and different ages of migration in the Caribbean. And the emphasis, of course, has to be on the impact of all this migration on Caribbean society and Caribbean culture. A great example of a great, very practical example of the way that migration affects and changes Caribbean culture is in the difference between, let's say, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. Actually, really just Barbados and Trinidad. Um, because what happened in Trinidad, as happened in, for example, Guyana or some of the other Caribbean islands to a lesser extent, is that after slavery, and well, I say after slavery, I mean after slavery and then after um, apprenticeship, which was basically just trying to stretch slavery out a little bit longer, they had these immigration schemes, they called them, that they instituted to get more laborers into the Caribbean. And so the four main places that they took people from were West Africa again, but also Madeira, which is an island in the Atlantic Ocean. I believe it's Portuguese owned. And the two big places that had an impact on the migration schemes and the labor and the demographic makeup of the Caribbean were India and China. Now, in a place like Trinidad, it's very, very prevalent. It's very immediately apparent to see the influence of that immigration of those Indian and Chinese people into the region. Um, you know, Trinidad is so very cosmopolitan, and you have not just as minorities, but as established social groups and demographics, carving out their own niches in the society with their own economic power, with their own um, like quite strong and quite competent social frameworks. Like um, Muslims and Hindus have schools, um, and in other places in the Western Hemisphere where that immigration was not as prominent or not even just didn't happen. The only religious schools, with some like one or two exceptions, are Christian and usually like Roman Catholic religious schools. Those are basically the only ones that exist in places where that immigration did not happen as intensely. For example, Barbados. So all that immigration that happened and that made Trinidad such a cosmopolitan society, none of that happened in Barbados. Barbados was pretty much for all of the history of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, all the history of Europeans coming to the Caribbean, Barbados was pretty much just Africans and Europeans. It was just black people and white people. And so the effect that that had is that the overwhelming majority of people in Barbados are people of African descent. And yes, there are Indian people, yes, there are Chinese people, but they are not as embedded in the patchwork of Barbadian society as they are in a place like Trinidad. And that's because whereas Trinidad got lots of immigration from Indian and Chinese people, um, quite early in the history of Trinidad society developing post slavery, Barbados didn't get any of that. And so Barbados is a very different society. It's not that cosmopolitan, it's very much homogenous in a lot of its cultural influences. And so, yeah, we have like one Muslim school here in Barbados. There are a lot of a lot of private religious schools, but so many of them are just Roman Catholic schools. I think a few of them maybe are Anglican, but most of them are Roman Catholic schools. And yes, there are also a lot of Roman Catholic private schools in a place like Trinidad, because again, it's cosmopolitan. All of these different groups of people who lived in Trinidad and immigrated there over various periods of time, the mark that they left in the culture is very prominent and very prevalent, very easy to see. But there's actually more to how immigration has so prominently affected the culture of a place like Trinidad as opposed to a place like Barbados. And I'm just using these two examples because those are my two family connections, half of Trini, half of Bajan. Um, so this meeting is about to run out of time. I will end it and then reopen it immediately so you can just join back right away. That's okay?
Okay.
Okay, so we're back. So yes, another way that the immigration of people and the movement of people has such a marked effect on the way that society comes together and the way that it's structured that is very visible, and it's quite a cool example. You know, if you're writing an essay on this in the exam, they ask you to describe some ways in which the movement of people influences culture and society. I think Barbados and Trinidad is a great example and counterexample to use. Because another way is that the indigenous people of the Caribbean, their presence and their prevalence in a Caribbean society also has a large impact on the way that Caribbean society is formed. So, in a place like Trinidad, you have a lot of, Amerindian people, First Nations, or the indigenous people of the region, um, by their many names that they go by. And they're not just there, but they themselves are also a part of the society, a part of the culture, um, the the awareness of them and the way that they impact the society and the culture of Trinidad is very prevalent and a big part of how Trinidadian people experience life in Trinidad. And that's because when the Europeans got to Trinidad, they met indigenous people. And that was like the first interaction of the European invaders with another group of people in the Caribbean context. When they started bringing Africans to Trinidad, they also had to interact, at least to some degree. They were there, they were present with the indigenous people who survived, the first Spanish wave of European contact in the Caribbean, which in almost all of the places in Caribbean and Latin America, as well as North America, actually, that it happened when Europeans encountered the indigenous peoples of the Americas. A large percentage of that population did die. They did not survive the encounter, either for reasons of war or for reasons of disease. But the fact is that they were never wiped out. However small a remnant remained in whatever context you're talking about, whether it's in North America or in the Caribbean or in Central or South America, they're there, and being the first people who lived there, their impact on the society is significant. In Barbados, so little backstory on Barbados, the indigenous people, the Taino people who lived in Barbados at the time that, in the pre-Columbian age, when the indigenous people of the Caribbean actually ran the Caribbean, um, they called the island Ichiruganaim. And Ichiruganaim is just their word, their name, which means the island that is far out. That's the translation of it that I got when I was studying history. The island that is far out. And they called it that because, if you look at the Caribbean, and this is the thing that was covered at the beginning of the Caribbean Studies syllabus when you talk about defining the Caribbean, looking at the geographical, geological, historical definitions and delineations of what exactly the Caribbean is. Notice that Barbados, which by all accounts is a Caribbean country, a Caribbean island, is not part of what we call the Caribbean archipelago, that chain of islands that curves so nicely around the Caribbean Sea. I hope you have a good idea of what a map of the Caribbean looks like, because it's just a very useful thing to know for doing any sort of Caribbean studies. So you have that archipelago that runs from up in the top. I think like maybe Cuba is probably a good place to start tracking, and then you just come around to the east and down to the south, and it ends with Trinidad before you hit the South American mainland. And that archipelago made it very convenient. That archipelago and the fact that the Caribbean Sea connected all of those islands, they talk about the lands washed by the Caribbean Sea, made it quite easy and quite convenient and efficient for the Taino and the Kalinago and all the Amerindian people who inhabited the Caribbean to have a society where inter-island travel and trade and warfare, a lot of the time, was um, a large part of the society, because it was just easy. They were expert navigators. They were experts in the water. There's an account, a story of some Columbian age explorers coming to the Caribbean and calling the Amerindian people Amazons, because when they got to an island, this is the story. It was basically only women there, and these women were like fierce warriors. They defended their island fiercely and tactically. They were excellent archers, and they were not just excellent archers. They were excellent at using a bow while like swimming, which those are two incredibly difficult skills, and to combine them just shows you how expert the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean were at navigating and living in this region. It was their region, it was very much under their control. And a lot of that was facilitated by the ease of travel that was provided by the Caribbean archipelago, being geographically oriented in the way that it is, and by the Caribbean Sea, making travel a lot less perilous than it was in the Atlantic Ocean, just to the east. Barbados is just outside of that archipelago. As you know, or as you probably know, the Caribbean islands, they are all volcanic in nature, and their geological makeup is volcanic rock. Barbados is not. Barbados is limestone. It's basically only part of the Caribbean because it's just close enough to the Caribbean archipelago that it makes sense for it to be included in the Caribbean. But at the time, the people living in what they called Ichiruganaim, they didn't think so. I mean, they tried it for a while, and there's definitely evidence of indigenous peoples, settlements, and civilization in Barbados. But eventually, they, and this is our historical speculation now, they abandoned the island, whether it was because of like hurricane or tropical storm devastation that basically destroyed the civilization that they had on the island, and they weren't really able to recover properly, and so they abandoned the island for the rest of the archipelago, or whether it was because, as they named the island for, it was just too far away to be convenient for, because they were traveling in dugout canoes made from palm trees or coconut trees, whatever was there. And it was not easy going from the relatively calm and easy to navigate Caribbean archipelago and the Caribbean Sea just out into the what is technically the Atlantic Ocean, and finding this island that is just out of the range of that archipelago. And so yeah, they abandoned the island, as the common theory and the common knowledge suggests, for somewhere else in the Caribbean. And that is why, when the Europeans came to Barbados, unlike almost everywhere else that they went in the Americas, in the New World, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, they didn't actually find any indigenous people. Maybe, again, they found some evidence that there were people there once, but the people themselves were not actually in Barbados when they got to Barbados. And that, again, has a massive impact on the way that Barbadian society evolved. Sorry about that. We've been having some internet issues recently. I don't know how much of it is to do with the weather systems, but yeah, sorry. So, where was I? Right. The the fact that there were no indigenous people in Barbados when the Europeans got to Barbados makes Barbados so unique from all the other Caribbean islands. Like Marinage, which you would have learned about in Caribbean history, and will probably, if you did Caribbean history, and you'll probably cover it. I think it's on this syllabus as well when we get to resistance to the colonial and enslaving and imperialist forces. I think Marinage is covered, but people running away and finding ways to build their own civilizations out from under the thumb of the European slave masters, the way it happened in Jamaica, and to a smaller scale in other Caribbean islands. But Jamaica is the big example because of just how successful the Maroons and Marinage in general were in the Caribbean. That couldn't have happened in Barbados. And the big reason, of course, is the geography of Barbados, it being much, much smaller than a place like Jamaica. You know, Barbados was essentially in its heyday, or in the heyday of British colonized Barbados, was essentially one large plantation. You step off of you step out of the boundary of one sugar plantation, and you're on the boundary of another one. The entire island was divided up amongst various plantation owners. There wasn't really anywhere for any Africans looking for freedom to run, and so the kind of marinage you had in Barbados was largely what we call maritime marinage, where you get on a ship and you escape from the Europeans that way, or urban marinage, where you get into a town and start doing some business to try to support yourself. But just running off and living off the land was an option in Jamaica because there's just enough land that the Europeans were not equipped to take over and colonize, but that's not the case in Barbados. But the other reason, and quite an interesting anthropological reason for the lack of that kind of marinage in Barbados, because there were gullies, you know, there are some caves, there are places that they could have gone in theory, but there were no indigenous people to teach the would-be Maroons, as happened in Jamaica, the geography, the ecology, the lay of the land, to teach them how to live in the Caribbean, because these were people who knew how to live in Africa, but the Caribbean is different climate, different geography, different ecology, different biosphere. What's the word I'm looking for? Not microbiome. Anyway, it's a different environment, different atmosphere altogether in order to live here. There are different plants, for example, different animals, and the reason that part of the reason I would say that the Maroons in Jamaica managed to be so successful is because they had the help of and they integrated into the communities of the indigenous people who actually knew the land, it being their land. And that couldn't have happened in Barbados because, again, the indigenous people had left long before any Europeans started bringing Africans to Barbados. And that's just another quite poignant example of the ways in which immigration and migration, the movement of peoples in general, influence culture and society so much. I'll just read through the rest of these notes from the syllabus. The first migrations into the region started with the Amerindians, who were either hunting for food or evading their enemies. The European interlopers' quest for gold and spices brought them to the region, which has become known as the cockpit of Europe. Cockpit not in the modern sense of the place where the pilot sits when he flies a plane, but cockpit as in a literal pit, a hole in the ground, that you put two roosters or cocks in, and you have them fight. And it was called the cockpit of Europe because that's essentially what was happening, and especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, when there was this event that historians nowadays have come to refer to as the breaking of the Spanish monopoly over the Caribbean. So the British, but also in smaller part the French, the Dutch, they they were fighting the Spanish for the massive monopoly, massive control that they had over all of the Caribbean region. There were a lot of fights between various European powers, but they weren't done in Europe. They were done in the Caribbean. So it wasn't England versus Spain, you know, with English people in England going to Spain and fighting Spanish people in Spain. It was English people coming from, for example, Barbados and going to oust the Spanish from their stronghold in Jamaica. And so when you look at it like that, they're not doing the fighting themselves, or at least they're not doing it in their own home, but they're very much still fighting it out. And so it was called the cockpit of Europe. And then afterward, after slavery, as we talked about, the Chinese and East Indian indentured workers came under a contract system. While the Chinese left the fields and opened shops, the East Indians stayed and toiled and in many cases acquired the very same land that they were working on. And of course, the contracts that they came and worked under were never really honored by the Europeans who made them because they were never really about treating the people like human beings or dignified laborers worthy of what they work for. But the Chinese and East Indians, because they were allowed to come with their culture and with their family structures, and they were not subject to so much of what the Africans were subject to, they were able to, in spite of everything, make their way in the Caribbean, which is again why the East Indian and Chinese um, Caribbean people are structurally and societally so different from the majority of the African people. Uh, so that's migratory patterns. Any questions about anything we mentioned before we move on to the cultural impacts of the migration?
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, and we'll just move on quickly. So, the migratory groups in the region left different significant impacts on aspects of culture such as food, clothing, and religion. Um, that's pretty self explanatory and very easy to look around and see. As the groups came into the region, cultural hybridization occurred, and this altered the various cultures in interesting ways. And terms like cultural hybridization, acculturation, um, my, syncretism, we have syncretism here, miscegenation, a lot of these words that have to do with the way that culture is altered and changed. I think we'll get onto those in more detail later. But for now, the two words that they want you to pay attention to are Creole, which in this case is not referring to the language, but referring to people of African descent born not in Africa, but in the colonies, or in some uses, people who are of mixed African and European or mixed ethnic background, whether it's African and Chinese or European and Indian, whatever. Those are the two ways in which Creole was largely used in this historical context. And of course, syncretism. I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about the West Africans and their experience of Islam and the Islamic Empire. But syncretism is a way of cultural. It's a cultural phenomenon in which certain features of something or other, whether it be a culture, a religion, a food, a practice, mix and match with certain features of a different culture or religion or practice. So a lot of Caribbean religions are syncretic in part or in small or large part syncretic of the various European denominations of Christianity that they encountered, and either the indigenous Americans' religions. So there's good examples when you look at the Maya and the modern day descendants of the Maya, where they have a religion that is, in large part, a syncretic religion that combines Roman Catholicism and the traditional ancient Maya religion. But in large part, you also have things in the Caribbean, where we have religions that are theologically, in large part inspired by the European Christianity, but also have influences of the other um, traditional African religions, West African, I should say, religions that would have been present in the influences of the people who themselves were exposed to this European Christianity. That's question. Go ahead.
I was researching on the spiritual Baptist, and
That's a good example.
um, you know what that is?
Yeah, that's a very good example of syncretism. And this is actually the kind of,
I want to know.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
just what the spiritual Baptists are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, speaking from my experience here in Barbados, because the thing about the Caribbean and the way that Caribbean societies work is that there's a lot of idiosyncrasies in different islands or territories, but generally speaking, the spiritual Baptist is religious, an indigenous Caribbean religious movement that, theologically speaking, is Christian. And so, for example, here in Barbados, the spiritual Baptists are members of, and it's been on and off over the years, but at the moment, they are members of our like Christian ecumenical body on a national level, our Barbados Christian Council. Um, I know there's a similar ecumenical body in Trinidad. I don't know if the spiritual Baptists are part of that body in Trinidad, but theologically, they are enough Christian to be part of such an ecumenical organization with other Christian churches. But a lot of their practices, their rites, their rituals are inspired and taken from the West African um, polytheistic or animistic religions that the Africans would have practiced. The Africans who were brought to the Caribbean as slaves would have practiced. For as like Orisha, for an example, I don't know exactly if Orisha or Shango is the influence behind the African practices and such in the spiritual Baptist religion, but they are similar. They it's yeah, theologically Christian. A lot of their practices and their ways and their focus, of course, is in the traditional West African religious practices that they inherited from the people who would have been brought from Africa, West Africa. Okay, so that's a good example of syncretism, and if you are asked to write an essay on syncretism, that's a very good one that you could do some reading on. And you'll hear me say something like that often, where I say, if you have to write an essay on this or that, or if you get a question on such and such, or this is the kind of thing that will come up in a multiple choice. Because really, I'm just trying to prepare you for the exam. And there are certain things that the exam specifically requires of you more than just general knowledge of the syllabus. And so as we go on, my main focus is on how to best prepare you for the exam specifically. Okay, historical processes. Part 3, systems of production. Has everyone done this, finished historical processes in school yet? Have you gone through these systems of production?
Um, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll just quick recap then. Factors which accounted for the movement of people within the region. Some key terms about the various systems of production that started in the region with the Spanish, for example, encomienda, repartimiento. In the French Caribbean, you have the uh, the Grand Blanc, the Petit Blanc, and um, the blacks. Uh, Plantations, of course, in the British Caribbean. Plantation economy was seen as the base of society, which influenced um, all social institutions, and this is particularly relevant in Barbados. So again, Barbados, because of its unique demographic history, being so not cosmopolitan, Barbados has it's basically, if you want to study the relationship between Europeans and Africans in as sterile, like laboratory conditions, you look at Barbados, because all the other Caribbean islands, they have kind of more naturalistic um, human societies with the various groups of people who were present, interacting and intermixing in interesting ways. But that puts a lot of different variables into the mix. But Barbados is very much just, and not even like multiple different groups of Europeans, because you know, for example, Trinidad or Jamaica, they've had the British, but they've also in the past had the French or the Spanish. As colonial imperialist forces in their island. Barbados was literally just the British and the West Africans that they brought. That was Barbados for pretty much its entire history. And so, what you get in Barbados is what Professor Henry Fraser has called the first true slave society. It was widely known to be the most brutal slavery in the Americas, in the Western world, in the New World. And it was for reasons like that Barbados was the place that they went when they wanted to get police forces, for example, out of the enslaved Africans, because the Barbadian people were the most mentally and psychologically colonized and enslaved, and they had also lived under the most brutality. And so, if you wanted people to perpetuate that brutality or reinforce the system, you went to Barbados. And so the plantation economy, being the base of society, is the most prevalent in Barbados, simply because of how small Barbados was and how, what's the opposite of diverse? The opposite of diverse Barbados was. But it's also prevalent in the other Caribbean territories to a point. Even though the various migratory groups were faced with the same forms of forced labor, or similar forms of forced labor, I should say, they forged ahead to develop Caribbean societies. Okay, so now we are getting to, it's still historical processes, but we're looking at the responses to oppression, passive and active. So we're looking at, let's see, passive revolts are considered to be non-violent means by which the oppressed class, takes back some control, fights against the oppressor class. All the oppressed groups under the encomienda, slavery, indentureship, apprenticeship systems had their own unique forms of revolts. So, for example, the Caribbean peasantry, and peasantry just means like a poor farming community, economically poor farmers, gave rise to new communities and led to the renewal of African ancestral cultural practices. So you have the marronage. So there's what you call grand marronage, which is where a large group of slaves, it's self-explanatory. A large group of slaves pick up and leave and form like a whole society somewhere in the mountains or in the hill country, cockpit country in Jamaica. As again, the big example, if you want to talk about marronage, you look in Jamaica. Petit marronnage, and they use grand and petit because the marron and marronnage come from the French, is basically a few slaves doing it on a much smaller scale. Um, so not setting up a whole society or a whole community, but just living like hermits or nomads off the land in a similar way. And then there's also, of course, maritime marronage, where you get on a ship, and it's where we get a lot of the what we might call under a large blanket pirates, which is privateers and buccaneers and any seafaring um, peoples who were not part of the European systems um, for seafaring. So you get on a ship and you just do some work as a ship hand on the deck, wherever you can just get some work. And that pretty much got you out of the plantation system because you were so free on the ocean, relatively speaking, of course. And then you have urban marronage, which is, again, slaves getting out of the plantation system and setting up business in the urban areas. It was not always successful. A lot of times it would not have been because of how, and it depends on how tightly controlled and how overbearing the plantation economy and the plantation society and the slave society was in the area where you're talking about. But for example, in Barbados, you have this one well-known example, and I'm sure it happened in lots of other places in the Caribbean and in the Western world in general, where you have prostitution as a form of urban marronage. It was one of the ways that people could live out of the immediate control of the Europeans and their systems of oppression. And so, yeah, it's one of the things that essentially they were driven to by the conditions. And so you have, not just in the Caribbean, by the way, this is all over the Western Hemisphere, but the specific cases in the Caribbean, brothels being one of the ways in which African women in the Caribbean were able to actually economically support themselves and by that system get out of these direct financial and economic and societal subjugation of the Europeans. Yes, so as we talked about before, Maroon's success relied on topography, like cockpit country and Accompang in Jamaica, well-planned communities and systems of government, these symbiotic relationships with the Taino, the indigenous people that we talked about before, guerrilla warfare and espionage, and of course effective leaders, such as in Jamaica, Nani. East Indian passive response included refusal to sign contracts, go slow action, the kind of more industrial um, action that you might expect nowadays. Um, in in some places, you had what was called the East Indian National Association, leading protests and strikes because the East Indians were not under, a chattel slavery like system, but they were still under a system of exploitation of their labor, and so that's how they resisted. The peasantry established villages and communities, so you have like free villages, as they're called, where these farmers who were able to support themselves in some way using agriculture were able to get out of the immediate direct subjugation of the plantation owners. They diversified the economy because in the Caribbean and especially in a place like Barbados, it was very much a monocrop and a monoculture economy. It was just sugar, and that's the entire economy. And not only was it awful ecologically, of course, it did a lot of damage to the soil and the soil quality and the integrity of the geology and topology of Barbados and the other Caribbean islands where sugar was a monocrop. But it was also really bad for the economy in that if something happens, like for example, beet sugar produced in various other places in the world that have larger scale and can afford to produce it cheaper and get more of it out um, and are not so dependent on it, if that kind of topples the Caribbean sugar market, then your economy collapses, or you at least are staring down the barrel of economic collapse, which is the biggest reason that chattel slavery was ended in the Caribbean. It wasn't about humanitarianism, it was just that sugar and slavery were not as profitable anymore. Let's see. Yeah, informal cooperatives. Peasants developed the interior of many territories because the Europeans really kind of concentrated around the coasts because they were, maritime people themselves and they were doing a lot of trading. So they would have been concentrated on the coasts, but the interior of these territories was left largely undeveloped by the Europeans. And so that's what gave the peasants in a lot of Caribbean territories the opportunity to develop them. Um, then we have movements towards independence, so political enfranchisement, universal adult suffrage, and internal self-governance. The factors surrounding political and economic enfranchisement and entrepreneurial activities all contributed to independence and self-governance in the region. Many countries fought long for self-governance, and entrepreneurship, of course, and republicanism were integral parts of it, but there was also the influences of Marxist theory, which we will get to much later in the syllabus. And so Marxism and socialism, in whatever form it was at the time, was a major political factor in the independence of the various Caribbean territories. You also have things, so there's, political enfranchisement, but there's also economic enfranchisement. Um, so, and this word enfranchisement just means self-determination, basically. So political enfranchisement means we govern ourselves. Economic enfranchisement means we are economically self-sufficient, that kind of thing. And so the things like credit unions being financial institutions controlled and owned by their members um, were part of what led to the economic enfranchisement of people in the Caribbean. And of course, economic enfranchisement is very often looked at from a functionalist perspective. And I guess we'll get to functionalist versus structuralist perspective next week. So I'll stop here for now with the course content, but just to give you kind of an overview of what to expect in this class. You are doing Caribbean studies at school, so I'm not just going to go over the syllabus that you're doing at school. That wouldn't really be a useful use of your time or my time. So what we're going to do is we're going to, of course, if you have any problems or concerns, I'll do my best to address them. What we'll do is we'll go in depth into the theory of Caribbean studies. So we'll look at the various philosophical perspectives, like the conflict perspective or conflict theory. We'll look at functionalist versus structuralist perspectives. We will examine the political and philosophical um, background of a lot of what took place in the Caribbean over its history. And this is all just so that you don't think of Caribbean studies as some intimidating external study. It's the life that you live and the world that you live in. You're just studying the thing that is all around you. So when you get into the exam, you should feel confident in your knowledge and understanding because you're living all of this already. All Caribbean studies is just putting some fancy academic words to the phenomena and the experience that you live every day. We're pretty much out of time. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Discord server, and I will do my best to address them. Thank you all for your time and your attendance, and I will see you next week, same time.